I'm Ryan Emberling, and I'm here today to tell you about my journey with Sails.js from an amateur to a professional developer. A bit about me, I'm the Director of Engineering at the Assistance Foundation, which is an ed tech nonprofit with a number of software products to help students and teachers with math education. I'm passionate about web development as well as about education. I love learning things, I love making things, and I love teaching things. I also play games and music. So let's talk about Sails.js. As you probably know, if you're at SalesConf, Sails is an MVC framework for full stack web development, and it's really easy to learn. Not only to learn how to use Sails if you're already a web developer, but even how to learn web development using Sails because it does so much work for you out of the box. And it also makes for rapid development. It makes it so much quicker and easier to build applications because it's a really powerful tool that has a lot of the configuration and hard problems of web development already solved for us. And it's appropriate for all career stages. So in the course of this talk, I'm going to um, talk about how my work with sales has evolved as my career has evolved, essentially, starting with as a novice who really knew very little, frankly, about web development overall up until my current situation uh, as a leader in my organization. Now, that said, I don't use sales at work, though I've learned a lot in ways that have helped me at work. So I instead use sales in my side project. Let's talk a little bit about what a side project is and how it can be helpful. There's really a number of different things that can be the benefits of working on a side project, but these are three of the ones that are most important to me. Working on a side project can help you to learn new things that you might want to be able to do either for work or otherwise. It also can help you make things that you get to use. And finally, you can even make things for other people to use as a part of your side project. So I have a particular side project called cuddle.cards, and I have used it for all three of these purposes. And we're going to talk about that as the project and my career has evolved. Cuddle.cards is a full stack real time web application built in Node.js using Sails, Vue, and tested end to end with Cypress. It's also the deepest card game under the sea. If you're interested in this kind of thing, it's actually a battle card game that's somewhat similar to trading card games like Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh, but that you play with a standard deck of cards. And if that's not interesting enough, this is a testimonial from Richard Garfield, the creator of Magic the Gathering, about how great a game Cuddle is. I really can't overstate how fun the game is to play for people who already love interesting card games like this or other ones who are looking for something different to play. So as I mentioned, I have started working on a side project, this Cuddle.cards project, when I was an amateur. I was working as a tutor and learning to code for fun, essentially. And I've continued working on it as my career developed to becoming a software engineer professionally, and even today as the director of engineering at my organization. So in the course of this talk, I'm going to explain how my work on Cuddle.cards and my use of Sails.js has evolved in these different stages of my career according to my goals and the techniques that I'm bringing to bear. So when I started working on Cuddle.cards with Sails, I was working as a tutor. And after quite a bit of learning, I was able to make something that worked and allowed me and some friends to play Cuddle online. And it looked like this, which have quite a ways to go, I'll say. I mean, it was an achievement for sure, and in hindsight, I am proud of where I got with this part of the project because I've made a functioning web application that let people communicate in real time over the internet to play this extremely cool card game, and that was really something. Um, but I revisited the project when I became a software engineer in order to remake it using tools and techniques that I wanted to practice for work, and I was able to make something that looked like this, which had come a long way. And in my current role as the director of engineering, I am actively improving Cuddle.cards all the time, and this is closer to its current state. So it's become more interactive and easier to use than ever before. Here you can see someone playing a card for a special effect that destroys many of the things on the board. So my work on this project has evolved along with my career. And if we take a little look at this video, we can see a bit more fully the state of the application. So you have a sign up page and then a home page where you can create and join games. Then wait for an opponent to join your game, at which point you can both hit the ready button in order to start the game. And then once it's started, you'll see that you can click on cards to find different ways to play them, essentially. And both players get updates through WebSockets for when their opponent has made a move so that they can continue to play the game back and forth. So with that, let's take a look at where I started with this project as a tutor. And before we even talk about my work on Cuddle there, let's take a look at the responsibilities that I had at work. These are the things that I was focusing on. So I was teaching one-on-one, working with people to understand the things that mattered to them, the things that they needed to learn how to do or wanted to learn how to do, and the things that they struggled with. Um, I did a lot of chunking of work, so finding things that people needed to do and breaking them into steps that were manageable and working with students to help them to problem solve. So I had a number of goals as I was setting out to build this website to play Cuddle. But the first among them was to learn full stack web development. I wanted to understand how is it that somebody makes a website that lets people interact in real time over the internet. And I wanted to be able to play Cuddle with my friends. To do that, I brought a few techniques to bear that Sails.js made it easy to come to understand because I didn't even realize at the outset that these were things I would need to do. The first was database architecture, having a structure that I could store data in persistently in order to have an objective source of truth that represented the state of the game and which players were in it and everything that was happening. Then I needed to be able to map requests, meaning process API requests to different URLs with functions in JavaScript. I needed to be able to manage user sessions. So this is something that Sails does very nicely out of the box for you, where it uses cookies in a certain way in conjunction with Redis, essentially, so that you can easily attach whatever data you want in JSON format, essentially, to browser tabs such that they can be quickly associated with an incoming request and such that the browser tab itself doesn't actually know about any of this data, which makes the process rather secure. So this is useful for flagging somebody's user ID once they've logged in and what game they're in, lots of metadata like that. And it's very helpful in many different web applications. And lastly, real-time WebSocket updates, which allow me to update the opponent, for example, when a player makes a move, because the player generates the request, and in a traditional REST API, the opponent will not necessarily be notified of that because the opponent themselves hasn't generated a request. But with WebSockets, we can update everybody who needs to know that something has changed. So here's the database architecture for the site. There's only three tables. We've got the game, user, and the card, and each of them have foreign keys to point to other records, essentially, which help us to manage collections, which is how Sails does many-to-many relationships, or generally relationships in its database architecture. So we have, for example, if we had a game that had an ID of 7 and we wanted to know what are the players that are in that game, we would look at the user table for all of the users who have a game column with a value of 7. Those would be the players in that game. And similarly, cards have foreign keys that either point to a game or to a user. So any card which has a deck column with a value of 7 is in the deck of game 7. If it has a scrap column of value 7, then it's in the scrap pile of game 7. And similarly, the hand, points, and face cards columns tell us that a card is in the hand, the points, or the face cards of a specific player. Now, all of the moves that get made in the game follow this very similar flow where a user clicks on a move that they want to make, and then a request is sent to the server and validated. in order to check that the request has all of the necessary data in order to do the thing that you're asking, and that you're allowed to do it because you're in the game and it's your turn. Otherwise, it'll send a snack bar message or an error that the front end interprets by creating a little error snack bar that says, for example, it's not your turn. So then, if the move is valid, we update the database and emit a socket message that both clients receive and then update so that both the browsers reflect the state of the game. So that was basically everything that was necessary in order to put together an initial deployment of the site that allowed people to play Cuddle in the version that you first saw when I showed the game. So now, when I became a software engineer, I undertook to recreate the site using skills that I wanted to practice for work, essentially. And that work consisted of full stack engineering, which had a focus on user experience. So I did a lot of front end work at that time, really trying to improve users' experience working with products. And I also was doing API development and database architecture. So these were all things that I wanted to practice, but especially user experience, because that was something that the Cuddle site itself was lacking in and that I really wanted to focus on for work. So my goals were to practice UX techniques and to make it fun to play Cuddle by employing those user experience techniques. And that really manifested in two things. One, I created a single page application with Vue to manage the front end. And two, I tested the application end to end with Cypress. So um, uh, in order to make the Vue, well, the reason that I wanted to make the Vue application was really threefold. For one thing, um, the tool chain in command line tools that was available for Vue was more powerful than what you get when you're just injecting script tags, essentially. So having a separate project that managed all of the routing of the pages on the front end allowed me to use other plugins like the Vuetify component framework, which or component library, which is a really powerful tool that we use at Assistments as well, and that I wanted to work with in order to make the application easier to use and better looking. And I really wanted to emulate my work stack where we were also using single page applications written in Vue. So uh, that involved basically making a separate project from what was originally the backend deployment. This is my sales app, which also had an Angular JS, like OG Angular front end, and supplementing this with a separate repository for the front end of the application, which was written in Vue, a separate single page application. And there are a few nuances to pulling off a single page application, having that connect appropriately to Sails, especially because I needed WebSockets. So in particular, I needed to use this part of the docs for the WebSocket usage with Node.js in order to instantiate a socket client that could connect to the right port, because the localhost development environment would serve the front end on port 8080, which is the Vue CLI default, whereas the Sails backend was served from the Sails default of port 1337, LEET port. And that meant that the front end was not being served on the same port as the back end, so it needs to be told where to connect to. And so I created in my front end this plugin file that I called Sails.js. I could have named it anything, but this is for the Sails configuration, so that name made sense to me. And it came down to creating this IO instance, which requires the Sails library and then gets configured to connect to port 1337. Um, and I'll note also that I'm exporting this constant IO, which allows me to import it in other places, like in my Vuex store, so that I can create requests, essentially, using that IO instance, which is then imported from the Sails plugin. So the second technique that I really brought to bear in practicing as I was remaking the Cuddle site as an engineer was testing the application end to end with Cypress. And First and foremost, this was enormously helpful for making development go more quickly because before I was using Cypress, every time I was working on a feature in a game, I would have to open two browser tabs and sign up as two different users, and then um, create a game, join the game as both users, say they were ready, and then the game would start. And then I could start interacting with the game and setting up the situation that I'm even working on, especially if it's some kind of edge case that happens deep in the logic of the game. It took a very long time to even set the application into a particular situation that I'm working on. So Cypress allows me to immediately load the game into a very specific state so that I can practice my development in a situation that I'm working on actively. It also helps me detect regressions in the application. So now that I've got a suite of approximately 160 end-to-end tests, I know that if something breaks functionality that's already tested, I'll be able to find that easily because the tests will fail. And that increases my confidence in the quality of code that I write as well as that other contributors write. So that has greatly improved the developer experience. And there are a few techniques that I learned in working with Cypress and Sails together that I'd like to share with you in order to make your test writing more efficient. The first is to make use of API endpoints that are only available in testing in order to do a number of setup things. And like wiping the database, for example, that you don't want to be exposed in production. And Sails makes it really easy to control access to these endpoints. The next is to make assertions and to take actions through the user interface with Cypress. Um, Next, to take actions and make assertions through the actual application logic, which I managed by exposing the Vuex store to the Cypress test code. We'll look at that in a bit. And then lastly, to make tests that involve multiple users interacting with each other in real time, which Sails and Cypress do so nicely together. So first, let's talk about test-only helper APIs. This is an example of an API endpoint in the test controller for wiping the entire database. It's pretty easy to write because it's just one promise.all of several model calls: game.destroy, user.destroy, card.destroy. Those are the only models, as we saw in the database architecture. And these destroy calls with empty dictionaries mean destroy literally everything, then turn a 200 response when it all works. So obviously, it's really important that this function and some of these other request mapped functions only be available in development for testing. And Sails makes this easy with the use of policies, which are middleware functions that run before your backend actions run in order to validate whether it's acceptable to execute the action. And in this case, everything in the test controller, as well as these specific endpoints that are not in the test controller, are marked as running the development or staging only policy, which is this function here. And it simply checks the sales.config.environment variable in order to confirm that it's either development or staging. And if it's not, it throws a forbidden error and does not proceed to executing the action, which ensures that we're never going to expose the wipe database endpoint on the production environment. So once you've got the endpoint defined, you can use Cypress to define a custom command to make a request to that endpoint. And it's as simple as using sci.request and pointing it to the right backend and the correct endpoint. And this new wipe database command allows me to wipe the database in my tests. So I use that generally in my before each hook. So before a given test runs, I will run the wipe database command. So the next technique that I used for end-to-end testing was to act and assert through the UI. And that started with adding selectors in the HTML that identify certain pieces of content essentially. And the best practice here is to use an attribute like this, data sci, which is named specifically just to avoid being necessary for any other purpose other than identifying this for selection. That way we don't have to rely on the IDs of HTML tags or any of the classes that are in them to identify which content we're talking about, so that if we have to change any of those IDs, it doesn't break anything in the future. So once we've sort of defined these attributes to identify the username and password fields, in this case, in the sign up form, then we can refer to them in testing like this. So here I have three different sign up tests to test signing up in different ways. The first it uses sci.get to get the username field, and it types a username into it. Then it uses sci.get to get the password field, and it types a password into that. And then it uses sci.get to grab a submit button and click it. And then we can check that the authentication was successful with this other helper function. And then this test is similar, except instead of clicking on the submit button, it hits the enter key after typing the username. And this works the same, but for the password essentially. So by using these selectors, we can easily identify parts of the application to interact with them in different ways. In addition to acting through the UI, you can also act directly through the application logic. And the way that can work is by exposing the application or a part of the application that you want to use for testing directly onto the window object. So in this case, I've captured app, which is the root application instance of Vue, and I'm exposing it to the application like so on the window object. And then we can grab that during testing. So that works like this. The side.window function will return the window object, and then we can use the its method to grab the store off of the application, which is tucked onto the window object, and then use Cypress's invoke to call this dispatch method. This is a Vuex method for calling actions that are defined in the Vuex store. So this way I'm requesting to sign up with a username and password that are passed to the command on behalf of the player. And I'm doing so without using the UI at all, which means that for tests where I need to have signed up first in order to get to the action of the test, like for creating a new game, for example, but where signing up isn't the point of the test, I can use this command to efficiently get through the process of signing up using the application logic without clicking on things in the UI. And that works like this. In my setup function, which is called in the before each hook of these tests, I can both wipe the database, which we already saw, go to the home page, sign up as a player, and then navigate to the home page URL. And then my test can start interacting with the game. Here we see interacting through the UI again, because this is the part that I'm actually testing, whereas the sign up is a prerequisite to the homepage tests because it's already tested in the authentication tests that we saw earlier. So here I'm getting the create game input, I'm typing a new game, and I'm hitting enter to create one. This is asserting through the DOM that the new game appears, and then here I'm making an assertion on the game in the store. So I am using again sci.window and .its to grab from the app its store and from the state the list of games, and using .then to grab that list of games and making assertions about how many games are in that list, that the first game has 0 players in it, and that the first game has a status of true, which means the game is open for people to join. So the last technique that I use in my Cypress testing is multi-user testing. And the trick here is to, in the test code, in this case, in my commands file for my Cypress tests, to instantiate a separate WebSocket client in the same way that the application does, but as a separate instance, which now my test code and commands can use in order to act on behalf of a different user who's not the one whose UI we're seeing. So in this case, I've got a sign up opponent command in Cypress, which works the same way that my application logic does, where I'm using that socket instance to make a request to the backend to sign up. However, this IO instance is the one that's defined in the test code, not in the application. And that combination of working with the application logic, either through the UI or directly through my Vuex store, and this separate test-only instance of the WebSocket client lets me act on behalf of 2 different users to manage very complex test flows. So this is kind of the bringing together of some of that in a helper function I called setupGame as P0, player 0, which will wipe the database, go to the home page, sign up two players, like both one player using the Vuex store action that we saw earlier, and then later signing up as an opponent using the the separate socket instance that's only exposed to the test code. It creates a game, subscribes to that game for the opponent as well as for the player, and then the game starts essentially. So it launches a game, creating two accounts, signing them up. All of this sort of boilerplate steps that take quite a bit of time to do manually happen very efficiently in the course of a test. So here's an example of a test that brings all of this together. So let's zoom in to the top here. And first, I'll note that before the test begins, we call that exact function we were just looking at, setup game as P0, which creates two accounts, creates a game, joins it as both players, and starts us inside the game. So by the time this first play points test runs, we're already inside the game. And from there, the first thing that this test does is it calls another custom command, sci.load game fixture. And this is a command that calls a custom API endpoint that's only for testing purposes, which takes an object that has this shape specifying the hand, points, and face cards for each player. And then it sets the game up into that exact situation. So we can programmatically define the context of this test. In this case, because we set the game up as P0, the cards that are in P0's hand, in this case the ace of spades and the ace of clubs, are going to be in the player's hand. This is the perspective that we see, whereas the ace of hearts and the ace of diamonds will be in the opponent's hand. And so after this API call to a testing only endpoint is made, we will log that the fixture is loaded, and then we can proceed from there on with the guts of the test, which starts by selecting a card inside the player's hand, specifically the ace of spades, clicking it, and then choosing to play that card for points, at which point the turn indicator should say that it's the opponent's turn. We then try to play out of turn, and after that, we use this assert game state function, which is the complement of the load game fixture function, in that it inputs an object of the same shape, as well as which player number, in this case 0, or player 0, you are looking at, and it makes assertions that both the DOM and the store state in Vuex all match the fixture object that you're specifying here. So in this case, we are saying that after we played the ace of spades for points, that it moved from the player hand into the player's points. And after that, we use this other custom command, sci.playPointsOpponent, to play a card as points on behalf of the opponent. And this uses that testing only socket instance of IO that lives in the command file. So this is the test code socket instance in order to play the ace of diamonds for points as the opponent. And then we assert the game state again, which essentially checks in this case that the ace of diamonds moved from player one's hand down to player one's points. So all of that together looks like this when we actually run the test. We can just refresh the page in Cypress to run it again. You'll see it immediately starts the game, loads it into the right state, and starts playing very quickly. And once the test completes, I'm actually free to click around in the application and continue to interact with it, which is incredibly powerful because this is one of the ways that it speeds up development. Essentially, I can set up a test in order to even just call that one helper function, setup game as P0. And now I'm suddenly in a game with two players in it. And this can save an enormous amount of time when you compare it with what I used to do when I didn't have automated testing software, and I would manually open two browser tabs and sign up as two accounts and make a game and join it as two players and ready it as two players to start it, and then I could start doing stuff. So between those and the ability to load the game fixture into whatever state I need the game to be, the ability in development to sort of play around after a test is finished is incredibly powerful. But when you combine this with a helper function for asserting your state thoroughly in terms of the DOM, the things we see on the page, as well as in the store, if you're using a store like Vuex, you get an incredibly powerful set of tools for acting on behalf of multiple users and really richly demonstrating complete flows in your application. So with that, let's take a look at the work that I've done on Cuddle.cards since becoming the director of engineering at my organization. This has sort of changed my responsibilities in some ways. I'm still a full stack engineer, so I work on everything from front end to the back end to the database. Um, across several of our products at Assistments, but I also manage teams. I work with engineers very closely to align them with product and engineering and design, I should say, to make sure we're very clear on what we're doing and why, who it's going to help, what problems the work that we're doing solves, and also working with engineers to help solve problems collaboratively, figure out creative solutions and how we ought to address the challenges that we face. And so this is because these are the goals that I had at work, or the things that I do at work. This kind of shaped the goals that I had for my side project on Cuddle, where I wanted to practice my management skills to improve my ability to support teams by more deeply understanding how people think and what matters to them in order to align the things that they care about with the things that are going to improve products. And in addition to that, I wanted to optimize operations in order to reduce the amount of overhead and time that myself and other contributors need to spend in order to process updates to the code and to execute deployments. And lastly, I wanted to grow the Cuddle community, both the active player base as well as the space of engineers who are interested in contributing to this ongoing development. So in order to achieve those things, I had a couple techniques that I continue to bring to bear, including product and engineering management, again, with a focus on deeply understanding what it is that people are interested in, what they like to do, what they want to learn how to do, and trying to align that as much as possible with things that are going to improve the product based on feedback that I get from the active players. And one of the other technical things that has made a significant improvement in the operations process is consolidating these two projects of the Sails backend and the Vue single page application into a mono repository. So now there's one project which you can install with a single command and easily boot essentially in just one directory. This has made change management much easier. And lastly, I've configured continuous integration and deployment using GitHub Actions in order to automatically lint, build, and test the application. So when it comes to management, I think first and foremost, the most important thing is the people. And I could not be more grateful to these amazing contributors who have done so much wonderful work to improve Cuddle.cards and make the game more fun to play for players as well as the code more enjoyable to work with as a developer and a contributor. They're all so awesome individually and together, and I am privileged and proud to have worked with each of them. Um, so the other side is the task management, where I work with the players and the users that we have of the site in order to identify areas for improvement, essentially, things that can be done to make either the application more fun to work with, to add features that couldn't be done, to fix bugs. And as well, I work with the engineers to identify things that can make it more gratifying and more efficient to write code that contributes to Cuddle and gets deployed to our production environment and used by real people. So I use Trello to manage that. There are different systems which various people use, and I'm sure I could do this more efficiently, but this is what I have so far. And as much as possible, I try to work with interested engineers to understand the things that they want to learn and practice in order to align those with things that will improve Tuttle. So to give an example of that, I'd like to talk about one contributor, Ben, who recently made a transition within his organization from a data science and data engineering role into web development. And so his primary goals in working with the code base outside of improving it as an active player were to learn full stack web development and to learn about the whole stack of the Cuddle application in order to sort of crystallize his understanding of how web applications work. And so as we were starting out, one of the first things that he contributed was to replace emails with usernames in the sign up and login process. So originally, when somebody came to sign up, they would have to provide an email address or something that looked like an email, actually, because we weren't, checking that any of the emails were real, doing any kind of validation other than just looking for an at symbol and a period, essentially. So we've got some feedback that this was intimidating to some new users who didn't want to submit their email basically to a new application that they were signing up for. And so in order to kind of lower the barrier to entry and make it more approachable to sign up for the site, we wanted to change email to username, which was more generic essentially and less intimidating. And this is a good fit for Ben because of his interest in the entire stack of the application, since the change, although it was relatively simple, did involve running a database migration as well as updating the backend, not only for the references to email directly, but changing the validation because we still have validation on usernames. We only allow alphanumeric characters, for example, but it doesn't have the same requirements as an email. So that needed to be changed on the policy level, as well as all of the tests that referred to emails and usernames, and of course the front end that consumed these as well. So this relatively simple change was at the same time a good introduction to the code base for him and a chance to engage with the entire stack from the database to the back end to the front end. So to give an example of another contributor, Scotty is an engineering manager who not only loves developing applications, but also creating infrastructure that optimizes workflows by automating processes that otherwise take time. And so when we worked together, his predominant contribution was to consolidate the front and back end projects into a monorepository. And it had a number of steps or milestones in order to ensure that you could easily install the application in one install and boot the dev server, build for production, um, things along those lines. And that work culminated in this single directory structure where we basically got the backend as it stood with the API, the assets, config, etc., as you normally see in a sales app. But it also has this client subdirectory, which is the entire Vue.js single page application. So what was previously Cuddle front view now lives in the client directory of the new repository, which is under the Cuddle-cards GitHub organization, and the new repo is just called Cuddle. So one of the reasons that this was so valuable from an optimization standpoint when it comes to operations is that previously we had a lot of interdependent pull requests where changes like the one that Ben made previously to the emails and username, which touch the front and back ends simultaneously, had to be managed at the same time in parallel and merged and built in a very particular order to make sure that all of the changes were rolled out and built at the same time and deployed in the right way. And there was a lot of opportunity for mistakes there, as well as just more time that had to be spent managing these changes in different places. And that took much more time when it came to running the tests and building the application because all of this work had to be done twice, essentially. In addition to the sort of ongoing cost for any given contribution, it also, by consolidating the project into a monorepository, it's much quicker now to onboard a new engineer who'd like to contribute because there's only one repository to clone and you can install it with a single command and easily boot from one window essentially. So it's much easier than before to get started downloading the code, running the tests, confirming that everything works, and making a contribution, which also can happen in a single repository as opposed to having to PR and do. Lastly, some of the optimization to the operations has come through continuous integration and deployment, which for us has come down to GitHub Actions essentially. And with the monorepository work and all of the tests that have already been created, this single YAML file of 32 lines was able to automatically lint, build, and test the entire application stack in a very easy to configure manner using only this one file. And that happens every time a pull request is submitted against the main branch or updated. And this has saved an enormous amount of time between having just one place to change the code and manage new changes and having the tests run automatically such that by the time I can do review, I know already that the tests have all passed. Um, I have been able to save an enormous amount of time. It's cut the rollout time after code has been written in half easily. So this has been a huge, huge improvement. Um, so if you take away anything from this talk, and I hope you do, there's really three things I'd like to drive home. The first is that Sails is awesome. It is a great tool for web development, whether you are learning web development for the first time or are already a pro. It saves a lot of time. It does so many great things for you and makes it easy to quickly build really powerful web applications. Secondly, side projects are also a fantastic opportunity to learn new skills, to make things that you might want to use or even that other people will use. And all of that is very helpful for growing your career as well as just learning cool stuff that can be a whole lot of fun. And lastly, and I know this is biased, but I really think that Cuddle is a fantastic game. If you're interested in card games, you really might enjoy it. And also, it's been an amazing project that I am so proud to have created and to have gotten help working on from this amazing team of contributors that I'm privileged to have worked with. So I really want to give back however possible. And if you are interested in learning full stack test driven web development in the Node.js ecosystem using any of the tools that I've talked about today, please feel free to reach out to me. I've got my email in the description of this video. Um, and I would be happy to talk with you. And if you would be interested in learning about the Cuddle code base, I'd be happy to show you about that as well. Contributors are entirely welcome. The project is completely open source and we have a small but passionate user base. So something cool about contributing to Cuddle is that it's an actively played game that you can not only see yourself, but any contributions you might make can get used by real people who actually care about your work, which I think is cool. So I want to thank the entire Sails community for this opportunity to speak, especially to Kelvin for inviting me to talk here at SailsConf. It is such an honor. I really appreciate it. And of course, thank you all for watching so much. I really appreciate your time. And I hope this has been helpful to you. And I hope that you like what I've had to say and perhaps even Cuddle. Thank you.